For 3 decades, the prevailing consensus in the West, from Washington to London to Brussels, was built on a single, comforting idea: the peaceful rise of China. It was a core tenet of globalization. The belief was that as China grew richer, it would inevitably grow more liberal, more democratic, and more integrated into the US-led international order. It would become a responsible stakeholder, a partner, not a rival. This was the grand liberal dream. But from the perspective of John Mearsheimer, this entire consensus was not just wrong, it was a dangerous fantasy. He argues that in the brutal world of international politics, there is no such thing as a peaceful rise. It has never happened in history, and it will not happen with China. This is not because the Chinese are inherently aggressive or uniquely malevolent. It is because of the tragic, ironclad logic of the international system itself. Mearsheimer's core thesis is that the most dangerous state in the world is a rising great power. As a nation's economic might grows, it inevitably translates that wealth into military might. And as its military might grows, it inevitably seeks to dominate its own region, its own backyard, just as the United States did in the 19th century. This structural reality, he argues, makes conflict unavoidable. It doesn't matter what Chinese leaders say. It doesn't matter if they intend to be peaceful. What matters is their capability. As China becomes more powerful, its very existence creates an intense security dilemma for its neighbors and for the current global hegemon, the United States. China, to guarantee its own survival, will be driven to push American power out of Asia. The United States, to guarantee its survival, will be driven to contain and weaken China. This is not a misunderstanding. It is not a policy choice that can be fixed with better diplomacy. It is a structural collision course. The liberal fantasy of a peaceful rise is, in Mearsheimer's view, the illusion that has disarmed the West and allowed this conflict to become inevitable. To truly understand why this conflict is unavoidable, we must first understand the theory that defines Mearsheimer's worldview. It is called offensive realism, and it is a profoundly grim, tragic, and cold explanation of how the world truly works. Offensive realism begins with 5 simple assumptions about the world. First, the international system is anarchic. This doesn't mean it's chaotic, it means there is no central authority, no global 911 to call when a state is in trouble. Second, all great powers possess some offensive military capability, the power to harm or destroy each other. Third, and most critically, states can never be certain of other states' intentions. A state that is peaceful today could, under a new leader or new circumstances, become aggressive tomorrow. Fourth, the primary goal of every state, above all else, is survival. And fifth, states are rational actors, meaning they will think strategically about how to ensure that survival in this dangerous, anarchic system. When you combine these 5 assumptions, the tragic result is that the best way for a state to guarantee its survival is to maximize its power. Not just to be one of the strong, but to be the strongest of all. The ultimate goal of any great power, in Mearsheimer's view, is to achieve regional hegemony, to become the undisputed dominant power in its own geographical backyard. This is the only way to feel truly secure. And just as importantly, a great power will work relentlessly to prevent any other state from achieving regional hegemony in their backyard. A state that dominates its own region can roam the globe and interfere elsewhere. A state that has a peer competitor cannot. This is the tragedy of great power politics. States are not driven by ideology or economics, they are driven by a relentless, cold, and unavoidable quest for power, all stemming from their desire to survive. This is the iron law of power, and it is this law that is now dictating the future of US-China relations. This brings us to China's grand strategy. From Mearsheimer's perspective, what China is doing today is not erratic, aggressive, or communist. It is perfectly rational. It is following the exact same playbook that the United States itself wrote. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, the United States was a rising power in the Western Hemisphere. It was surrounded by other great powers, Britain, France, Spain, and Russia. And it systematically, ruthlessly, pushed every single one of them out. The most famous expression of this was the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. This was a declaration that the Americas were America's backyard, and that other great powers were no longer welcome. The U.S. fought wars, from the Mexican-American War to the Spanish-American War, to establish itself as the undisputed regional hegemon. By 1900, it had succeeded. John Mearsheimer argues that China is simply pursuing its own Monroe Doctrine. China is a rising power surrounded by American allies, American military bases, and the American Navy patrolling its coastline. From Beijing's perspective, this is an intolerable security threat. To feel secure, China must become the regional hegemon of Asia. It must push the U.S. military back, beyond the first island chain, the islands from Japan, through Taiwan, to the Philippines. This is why China is building a world-class navy. This is why it is building artificial islands in the South China Sea. This is why it is determined to absorb Taiwan. These are not acts of irrational aggression. They are the logical, predictable, and unstoppable steps of a rising power seeking to dominate its own region, exactly as offensive realism predicts. China is simply, as Mearsheimer would say, acting like a great power. It is trying to guarantee its own survival in the only way the system allows. And this puts it in a direct, head-on collision with the current hegemon. This is the other side of the tragic equation. If China is the irresistible force driving for regional hegemony, the United States is the immovable object whose entire grand strategy is dedicated to preventing it. The United States, Mearsheimer explains, is a unique power. It is the only regional hegemon in modern history. It dominates the Western Hemisphere. Because its own backyard is secure, it is what Mearsheimer calls an offshore balancer. It does not tolerate peer competitors. For over a century, America's core foreign policy interest has been to ensure that no single state dominates Europe, and no single state dominates Asia. It is the offshore balancer that swoops in to check any nation that gets too powerful. The US entered World War I to stop Imperial Germany from dominating Europe. It entered World War II to stop Nazi Germany from dominating Europe and Imperial Japan from dominating Asia. During the Cold War, it dedicated all of its resources to containing the Soviet Union, which threatened to dominate both regions. From this perspective, China is simply the next in that line. China is now far more powerful than Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, or even the Soviet Union at its peak. It is a true peer competitor. Therefore, Mearsheimer argues, the United States has no choice. It must do everything in its power to contain, weaken, and, if possible, break up Chinese power. It doesn't matter who is president. A Democrat or a Republican, a liberal or a conservative, will be forced by the iron logic of realism to adopt a hardline containment policy against China. The US cannot, and will not, tolerate a Chinese regional hegemon. This is not a choice, it is a structural imperative. The two greatest powers on the planet are now locked in a security competition that neither can escape. So if this conflict is structural and unavoidable, how did it happen so fast? Mearsheimer's answer is that this is the story of the greatest strategic blunder in American history. While realism predicted this competition, America's own liberal foreign policy is what made it so powerful, so quickly. This blunder was the strategy of engagement, adopted by President Clinton in the 1990s and continued by George W. Bush and Barack Obama. The core idea, as we discussed, was a liberal fantasy, that by welcoming China into the global economy, especially the World Trade Organization, WTO, in 2001, the US could make China rich, democratic, and peaceful. Mearsheimer argues this was strategic insanity. From a realist perspective, you never help a potential rival get stronger. States care about relative power, not absolute gains. It doesn't matter if the US economy also got rich, if China was getting rich faster and turning that wealth into military power. For 20 years, the United States actively subsidized the rise of its own peer competitor. It shared its technology, opened its markets, and moved its manufacturing base to China, believing that economic interdependence would lead to peace. But the Chinese, Mearsheimer states, were playing a realist game all along. They took America's investment and technology, grew fabulously wealthy, and used that wealth to do exactly what realism predicts: build a military that can challenge the United States for dominance in Asia. Washington's liberal elite, high on the end of history illusion, believed they were building a partner. What they were actually building, Mearsheimer argues, was the factory that would produce the missiles, aircraft carriers, and fighter jets that America will one day have to fight. By the time Washington pivoted to Asia, around 2011, it was already too late. The blunder was complete. The US had wasted its unipolar moment and had, with its own hands, created the most formidable rival it has ever faced.